a nationwide television broadcast on May 10th of this year, many of you heard presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche warning that the United States was on the verge of a new worldwide financial collapse, like that which occurred under President Hoover during the summer of 1931. He told you that it was impossible to predict the exact date of a world financial collapse. He warned that the collapse might begin next week, or might be postponed as long as into this fall, or, as a bare possibility, might not explode until early next year. The next day, May 11th, it was announced that the 8th largest bank of the United States, Continental Illinois, was at the edge of bankruptcy. Approximately a week after the Continental Illinois crisis began, the leading governments of Latin America announced the formation of a debtors' cartel. Then, on May 19th, the thing which Henry Kissinger and the U.S. Treasury Department said could never occur, did occur. The governments of Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil formed a debtors' cartel against the ruinous looting policies of the International Monetary Fund and the U.S. Federal Reserve. The thing that Henry Kissinger and top officials of the State Department and Treasury Department promised never would happen.
We manifest our concern that the aspirations of our peoples to development and the economic security of our continent are seriously affected by foreign acts. We call for a meeting to the end of defining the most adequate initiatives and courses of action with a view to reach solutions satisfactory to all the nations involved.
Tonight, the world and you, your family and your local community are sliding downward towards the depths of the worst depression in modern history. President Reagan's Herbert Hoover prosperity has come to a screeching halt. Yet, even after the first round of the new worldwide financial collapse has become headlines in the international press, top officials of the Treasury Department are still insisting that there must be no alteration of Henry Kissinger's monetary policies. On May 13th, Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan said,
"We're in the midst of a solid economic recovery. Our policies are now bringing the world results. The recovery overseas couldn't occur without our own economy turning up first. It has, and now others are recovering, and the process has accelerated."
On May 24th, another LaRouche hater in the Reagan administration, Treasury Deputy Secretary Tim McNamara, said about the South American debt crisis,
"My conversations with the fund indicate there is excellent progress down there."
And a May 25th UPI wire quoted Treasury Undersecretary Beryl Sprinkle, assuring everybody of an endless U.S. economic recovery.
"We believe there will be an upbeat economic summit in London. President Reagan will be reaffirming the kinds of sound policies being pursued in the U.S. and encouraging other leaders to pursue these elsewhere so that we can sustain the summit country's current economic expansion."
There is perhaps only one man who has the expert knowledge and willpower to bring the United States and the world out of the present spiral of worldwide financial collapse. If you care about your family and your country, millions of you will act now to make that man the next president of the United States. He speaks to you now. Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche.
Those foolish officials who would try to say that there is no financial crisis, even after the collapse has begun, will try to tell you the Continental Illinois crisis is only an isolated individual case. It's true that certain powerful foreign financial interests did create a run against that bank. And it's also true there were special circumstances which made it possible to organize such a run on that bank at that moment. The fact is that most of the banks of the United States could be hit by the same kind of crisis at almost any time. The reason that it was possible to plunge Continental Illinois into that crisis is that the banking system as a whole is at the brink of collapse. To recognize what the Conti Illinois crisis means, look back at the newspaper headlines from the time President Hoover was still promising that prosperity is just around the corner. Look back for a moment to the newspaper stories of 53 years ago.
The Hoover administration was saying,
Worst stock crash stemmed by banks. Leaders confer. Find conditions sound. Stocks collapse, but rally at close cheers bankers. Bankers optimistic.
then, in September 1931, the worldwide depression exploded into the headlines.
The Vienna Bank has collapsed.
Like the Continental Illinois crisis of these past weeks, the collapse of the giant Wiener Kreditanstalt Bank did not bring on the Great Depression of the 1930s all at once. Over the summer of 1931, foolish optimists, like those around Washington today, insisted that all will be well once a few technical adjustments took effect. The world waded through a crescendo of local financial crises throughout the summer of 1931. Then, in September of that year, the British pound collapsed. The Great Depression, Adolf Hitler, and World War II became the worldwide realities set into motion by the foolish governments and big financial houses of Washington, New York, and London. The only important difference between the Great Depression of the 1930s and the new worldwide depression erupting today, it is unless we act now to stop this new depression, it'll be far, far worse than any of you old enough to remember from the 1930s could remember. This depression can be stopped, and stopped right now, but only by a U.S. president strong enough to force savage reforms on both the Federal Reserve System and the International Monetary Fund, as well as on that silly bureaucracy over at the State and Treasury Departments. I could stop this depression right now if I were your president. I could stop this depression right now if President Reagan would allow me to guide his hands through this deadly crisis. I am personally fully aware of my personal limitations. With all those limitations, there is no other presidential candidate who has the knowledge and intellectual toughness to lead our nation and the world out of the new world depression, which began to erupt with the crisis of Continental Illinois on this May 11th. History has repeated itself. The same stupid mistakes made by the administrations of President Calvin Coolidge and President Herbert Hoover have been repeated by the administrations of Carter Mondale and President Reagan. The policies which have led us into this new worldwide depression spiral this past month are very nearly exact copies of the policies of the Coolidge and Hoover administrations. The policies of Paul Volcker and Donald Reagan, which have sent us plunging into a new worldwide financial collapse, are copies of the stupid policies of Hoover's Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon. Not only have the Carter, Mondale, and Reagan administrations learned nothing from the way in which Coolidge and Hoover brought on the Great Depression of the 1930s, the leading circles in Washington and the international banking community have listened to and have rejected repeatedly my forewarnings of exactly what has happened during the month of May. As many of you know, I'm the designer of the LaRouche-Riemann quarterly economic forecast for the United States. Over the period from November 1979 to the end of 1983, this published forecast has been consistently the most accurate forecast published anywhere in the world. During the same period, the published forecasts of the U.S. government have been consistently absurd, and other published forecasts of private forecasting agencies correct only for a few isolated quarters. In other words, these governmental and financial circles have been continuing a policy leading directly to the disaster which erupted this May, although they knew that the world's most accurate forecasting service had warned repeatedly that this new financial collapse would occur during the first half of the 1980s unless present Federal Reserve and IMF policies were drastically reformed.